So without further ado, let's get started in this particular session. This is entitled Risk Analysis and Risk Management in the Energy Industry, a Tightrope Walk. Now, as prep for today's session, I've delved deep into the subject matter, spent a great deal of time investigating tightrope walking. Anyone here a tightrope walker? Anyone done any tightrope walking? No, I haven't either. But if you're like me, you kind of look at this act with a mix of awe and fear, right? It's totally captivating. And it's usually used as a metaphor to describe navigating through a sort of treacherous conditions. One of, I'm sure, this group's favorite authors, Nassim Nicholas Taleb, who is author of The Black Swan, said, or famously said, life is a tightrope between two errors, generalizing the wrong particular and particularizing the wrong general. I'm going to need a bunch of conversations with some Stanford guys after this to understand what the heck that all means. But I think, we typically look at tightrope walking as a spectator sport, something that we look at, and we look at it from that perspective of just sheer, perhaps terror. But I think we have to reframe it. And by reframing it, if we look at it from the participant's perspective, it's a totally different experience. In fact, Carl Wallinda of the famous Wallinda family of tightrope walkers said, being on a tightrope is living. Everything else is waiting. So do you know what they call a tightrope walker? Any clues? A funambulist. And today, we have an illustrious panel of 3 funambulists. So let's let the fun begin. All right. So risk analysis and risk management are critical in the energy industry. I think we all know this. What's the past, present, and potential futures of the practices, especially with regards to safety, operational integrity, etc.? Where and what further role and elements could decision quality play in those potential futures? So let's introduce our illustrious panel. To my immediate left is Rob Lazenby. He's a mechanical engineer, 33 years at Chevron. He calls himself a downstream jack of all trades. He's been in just about every part of the downstream operation, from design engineer, finance, ops, process, safety. And currently he's involved in optimization and lookbacks. He's a full-time DA since 2015, but he's been practicing elements of decision quality perhaps his entire career. Next to him is Jim Hoppenworth. Jim is a graduate of economics from the University of Chicago with an MBA from the University of Alaska. He's worked in finance and strategy planning at Alaska. His last role at Alaska, the big pipeline company, was enterprise risk manager. He then worked for the state of Alaska and is currently involved in pipeline risk management for DCP Midstream, a combination of Enbridge and Phillips 66. To his immediate left is Sam Savage, PhD and comes from a background, he calls it a mathematical family background. And his father is the author of A Savage Axiom? No, Sam corrected me and said, no, it's the Savage Axiom. I think that's wonderful.
That's plural, there are several.
Excellent. Deeply fascinated in OR. His experience ranges all the way from musician, puzzle maker, race car driver, author, but fabulous engagements at working for GM Research as a professor at the University of Chicago. He's an accomplished author and is a firm believer in the flaw of averages. So with all that set up, gentlemen, let's talk about what your experience has taught you about risk management, some examples of your experiences. Let's start with Rob.
Thanks, Jeremy. So, as Jeremy said, my background primarily in refining and downstream, so lots of supply type stuff. And the first thing I want to throw out is, when you say risk management, depending on what part of the business you're in, that means very different things. And even if you're saying safety and integrity for risk management, the question is it personal safety? Is it processing equipment safety? Is it operational safety or business continuation safety? My experience, and maybe we'll build on this more as this conversation goes, the opposite of risk is opportunity, or negative risk is opportunity. Even in compliance, even in areas where you're being forced to look at contingency planning, there's opportunity to extract value. And I've actually seen some of that with some success, I think, as DAs, decision analysis, and perhaps even with some of the data that's out there. There's increased opportunity, that if it's compliance, probably it's across the board. Everybody has to do it. Can you find a way to do it better? Can you find a way to do it in such a way that you can extract value from it? Historically, I was involved in the equipment. I was the process safety manager for a refinery when we were first looking at putting in safety instrumented systems. This is the idea of trying to take the fail-safe modes out of the hands of humans and get it so that if something happens, your facilities go to some kind of a mode automatically where bad things will not happen. In refining, in downstream, people don't want bad things to happen for many reasons. It honestly is because they don't want to hurt people. Honestly, people outside the industry have a hard time believing that. But there's also a self-preservation aspect to that from a business perspective. In this day and age, if you have a bad day, you may not restart. Increasingly with the regulation and the scrutiny on the business, if a facility has a significant operating problem, they have a significant leak or a significant emission, they will have increasing difficulty getting the regulators to give them back their permit to operate. So in addition to hurting people, so in addition to impacting the neighborhood, you may also be out of business. So that's a reality. In that context, there are ways you can find ways to extract value. The simple act of building scenarios of where things can go wrong, the simple act of doing contingency planning for saying, what would I do if, can also daylight things where you go, hey, I should be doing this all the time, right? And that's where we can extract some value.
Excellent. Jim?
Sure. When we think about safety in oil and gas, we're often thinking about the big accidents, the more catastrophic kind of risks, which is process safety. And there's actually a fair amount of thought that's gone into how to manage process safety. Some of you might be familiar with something called a quantitative risk assessment, which has good logical, correct reasoning. It has good data. Industry incident rates have been fully researched and described. But when that QRA gets done in oil and gas, it's not maybe quite how we practice decision analysis, because, well, first off, the frame might not be broad enough, and the people doing it often don't have much insight into some of the broader things happening at the company, the finance side, the strategic side, and they're not able to bring that in very well. In fact, what often might happen, I saw this at a company, the engineers could identify yeah, you've got this huge risk with vapors possibly coming up through the drainage system into a facility where people are at, and there's an explosive risk here, a threat. And they just, and a large amount of risk units were put on this particular risk. But they sort of, what often happens with these process safety engineers is they sort of throw it over the wall and they expect someone else to kind of take care of it from there. They're not involved in the full decision process. And they don't want to be either, it seems. So I came back and having a role in finance and strategy and asking them, so there's a huge number of risk units on this. Is this right? We go through that, we figure out, yeah, it's right. But nothing's been done on it for a couple years and nobody's concerned about it. So where you get is you don't quite have good framing, you don't have follow through, which leads to maybe a bigger issue. You might have good analysis and good decisions where you do the analysis, but it's maybe in the quality, in this decision quality circle, maybe the breakdown more often in oil and gas isn't logical reasoning, isn't the data, it's going to be the commitment to action, the implementation, the organizational issues. You get a combination of a number of organizational issues that lead to these big catastrophic things that we think about when we think about risk in this industry.
Sam, what about from your perspective, what are some examples or experiences that you've seen, the good, the bad, and the ugly?
Sure. I'm going to start sort of with, I've been doing some work with PG&E, but I got into that through work down at the California Public Utilities Commission. And let's just start at the very, very basics. The word risk is just almost undefinable, but I want to try to do it here. But let me just ask you this. Anyone think there's a risk that IBM stock's going to go down next week? Show of hands. The heck there is. I've shorted IBM. The risk for me is it goes up. Here's how I see risk. There is uncertainty in the world. Yep. And there are utility functions based on that uncertainty. Uncertainty and utility functions, does that remind you of anything? Isn't that what decision quality is about, is somehow tying your utility function to the uncertainty? Well, wherever I look at it, like down at the CPUC, think of it this way. You know, life is sort of a crapshoot. And in risk, you know, all you can do is lose, right? But the way people are going about it is they're modeling the crapshoot with average dice. They have 3.5 dots on them, right? And people say, oh, no, we can handle that. Don't worry about the 3.5 dots, because let's map our utility function into this. Like, I'm really worried about 5 happening. Oh, great, okay. Well, then when you weight it with the 5, then I come up with like 4.25 dots. Great. Yeah, that's for your utility function. How about someone else who's really worried about the 1s? Oh, well, then we'll weight it different. Then we'll have a die that has 1.5 dots on it. My point is, you ought to be playing with real dice. And that's the flaw of averages. If we boil any of these things down to single numbers, we're sort of done for. Oh, but so what's happening in the real world? So I was on a committee down at the California Public Utilities Commission to help define risk. And I said, look, risk has got to be like, you know, you could have a bunch of things happen and they could have adverse outcomes and they could have probabilities of happening. Now, mind you, where we're coming from and the sort of rough, I mean, people using colors for risk, it's so non-quantitative, like any improvement would be, anything quantitative would be improvement. So let's say there's 1 chance in 10 that someone gets killed. Transformer blows up, 1 chance in 10 someone gets killed. Okay, so that's 1/10 times 1, that's a risk score of 0.1. This is sort of the way things are headed now. Okay, but what about 1 chance in 100 of 10 people being killed? The score is 0.1. 1 chance in 1,000 of 100 people being killed, 0.1. I've worked out the math. 1 chance in 74,600,000,000 of everyone on Earth being killed, 0.1. To quote the comedian Louis Black, are you shitting me?
All right. So, with that, Jim, just think through for a second, based on what your experiences have shown you, what do you see fundamentally changing now? What do you see kind of working a little better than it may have worked in the past? What do you think really fundamentally needs further attention in this regard?
Sure. So, in oil and gas, in the pipeline industry in particular, there's a movement now towards instituting safety management systems. And there's a commitment made at the industry level, we're going to have safety management systems. Now, what is that? You see it in other complex technology industries. You see it in the airline industry. You see it, of course, in the nuclear industry. A safety management system is a set of processes to make sure the different parts of the company are working well together to manage risk. And there's a danger, of course, that it gets too bureaucratic. And of course, culturally, some companies really like their decentralization, and they don't want to move that way. But yet, the industry has made that commitment. It is successful, I think, in managing risk very well. And so safety management system is one thing that's happening. Another idea is the idea of enterprise risk management, which basically is kind of saying, maybe it's kind of saying centralization might be something we want to look at. And we want to solve that thing I talked about a minute ago. We want to make sure safety decisions are put next to the economic decisions and the business reliability decisions and the other kinds of, considering them all together so that you can have the right, so you can frame the decision problem correctly and look at all the alternatives that are there properly. And so rather than throwing things over the fence from the safety group and letting someone else worry about it, in which case it may not get done. The safety management system thing, going back to that hits on more of the organizational issues that I was talking about earlier that sometimes fail. If you think about that decision quality circle, that commitment to action circle, that's what a safety management system is trying to address. And you can see, so for instance, in the Texas City refinery explosions back in 2005 or 2006, some of the organizational issues that were identified there were sort of kind of a relaxed compliance environment in terms of compliance to the internal processes. If it was an external compliance issue, for instance, an environmental standard, managers were very much on top of that. That was licensed to operate. You're definitely going to mitigate that. You're going to solve that one right away. That's high priority. But internal safety processes somehow got much less attention. It wasn't something managers went after. And that's something the safety management system addresses. A whole range of other organizational issues could be talked about the same way in that disaster, and they replicate themselves across these disasters. You see the same patterns. So that's something I'd say.
How would you like to build on that, Sam?
Yeah, so we were doing stuff with PG&E, and actually a technique that I think really would work, and we're hoping is going to be adopted sort of in the energy industry, is if you go to, say, Goldman Sachs and look at how they're measuring their derivatives portfolio, lots and lots of things in the portfolio, lots of dice being rolled, right? Or insurance companies, lots and lots of insurance policies, lots of dice being rolled. In that case, first one, the dice being rolled are the prices of underlying assets. And in both industries, I don't know how widely adopted, but at least I know at Goldman Sachs and at some of the insurance companies, they roll the dice and they store the results in a database. So for example, at Goldman Sachs, this was years ago, they have ginormous databases of sample paths of ongoing prices, so they can model their risk against that. Now, we were in the process of sort of installing that at PG&E when the excrement engaged the ventilating device, and yet it was wonderful work, and there were people there who really liked what we were doing, and I think this can be adopted more generally. At probabilitymanagement.org, my nonprofit, we've been trying to establish open standards for this sort of database, right? So it's not closed in some siloed thing at Goldman Sachs, but that we can all share this kind of stuff in an open manner across any software platform.
Excellent, excellent. Now, Rob, any further comments from your perspective?
A couple things strike me. One is I think we have to be clear. Things are getting better. Things are dramatically different, and I think for the most part improved from, say, 30 years ago when I first stepped in the door, 33 years, walked in the refinery. Practices that in the past were very controversial are now like no-brainers. We don't put construction contractor trailers in operating plants when we're doing SIMOPS construction anymore. When I started, that was just, you just did it. I mean, because they're close to the work that way, right? So, Texas BP pointed out in a very obvious way this was a bad practice. We've seen it time and time again. And now it's a no-brainer. You don't do that kind of stuff. I think the other thing is early on there was a lot of focus, because kind of like it's a bimodal from a safety perspective. You've got personnel safety, which I think has been worked a lot. And, people, safety equipment, PPE standards, exposure monitoring, that's all happening. And the kind of, in the 90s, that took a front seat. People were trying to deal with their incident rates, their trips, slips, and falls. It was kind of the forefront, and we lost sight of some of the process safety issues. In the last 15 years, I think the process safety stuff has also been elevated. However, we still deal, to get to Sam's point, we still have a tough time figuring out how to deal with the low probability, high consequence issue. For the most part, the qualitative assessments we do, I think, are good enough at daylighting the issues. Certainly not very good at highlighting the solutions. I'll agree completely there. But how to properly deal and properly rank those low probability, high risk issues, especially when you don't have a database, because let's face it, if we're running our business properly, we're not seeing those events, but all of our facilities are aging. Those are hard. And those are very hard, especially at an operational level. So you really do need some kind of an industry approach. You need some kind of a collective approach to figure out how to do that. I see us making steps there. We do have increased data on inspection techniques. There's reliability-based inspection is where we're no longer just simply saying a piece of equipment has to be looked at every X years. If you have the data, you can go in and look at corrosion rates, look at monitoring rates, and make decisions on when the right time is to go in and inspect. And not only that, there's other mitigation factors. Perhaps you can change the operating conditions to extend life on some of this equipment. But those are all areas where 20 years ago we didn't have the data because people weren't collecting it properly. Now we're starting to collect the data. That's a potential avenue I see for some of this data science stuff we've been talking about, in the last couple days. I also am hearing from some of those reliability groups where they're trying to engage DAs, they're recognizing they need to frame these problems up. And so the framing of the problem, understanding what is the real value here, what is the opportunity, and how do you extract value from it, I see that as being a huge area, whereas collectively people are starting to wake up to that simply doing it for compliance, there's more to it than that.
Okay, all right. And that sort of then bridges into sort of our final structured question, which is really this: some of you have got more of an optimistic view of the future. Some might be not so inclined, but tell me, sort of, what does the future hold? What things do you think are going to get better? And really structure for the audience a sort of a world of the future that you would paint, and focusing in on the role that decision quality might actually play in this. And why don't we turn it over to Sam? Why don't you start us off?
I want to start optimistically, because you were talking about people have got data, they're beginning to share data. Yeah, I like that, and that should be sort of mandatory. So, you know, there are big organizations. PHMSA is a pipeline safety organization. There are a bunch of these things. And you see, there's a strong disincentive to want to recognize a risk, because if you recognize a risk, then you're liable for it. I mean, this is just human nature. And by the way, you simply can't overcome that. But if we have public sources of data that aggregate across the whole industry, and you know that this piece of pipe has, you know, 1 chance in a million of blowing up next year, and it's publicly acknowledged that it does, then we can sort of force people to build risk models. Because you've lost your plausible deniability, right? And so, in effect, we have to have the regulators kind of insist that we have these databases of the die rolls, is the way I would put it, right? So you can't deny that you have that risk.
So I don't disagree with the concept. First of all, I am actually quite positive about the direction things are going. I think things are generally getting better from an industry safety perspective. I have serious problems with the quality of the data. And I know how good my internal data is in some respects. And I know how good some of the third-party data I've looked at on some projects is. So simply throwing all that stuff out in a database and then making policy decisions based on it is frankly scary. It's
I wouldn't insist on that. I mean, let's apply data quality to it.
Right.
I'm just saying, moving in that direction to get this stuff
Right.
vetted and publicly available.
But that in itself becomes, I think the last session we talked a bit about data quality and about getting the data cleansing. The ability of an operating business to go in and do the data cleansing on all of the stuff that might be relevant is soul crushing, and we don't have the expertise, and it isn't immediately adding. You can't point to it if you think of it as our DQ thing. The doing it for the sake of doing it doesn't have a value function. And if you tell people they have to do it for the sake of compliance, and if that's the way we approach it, you're going to get the minimum value out.
So you're looking for some sort of incentive system.
Well, I'm saying to force everybody to share it. Every time you force that, you end up with minimal quality data. You know, think of the data that's in the oil and gas journal about refinery capacities. And if you ever look at that data, and if you ever know anything about how those refineries actually run and what their real limits are, that data is interesting but not very useful. So that'd be my concern with a mandated approach to submitting databases.
Okay.
So I'll agree on one thing and disagree on another.
Excellent panel. Excellent.
I do agree the industry is becoming much safer over time. The risk analysis is better. The implementation is better. The data is better over time too. There's the Center for Chemical Process Safety is publishing books with indices of what the probability is for different process safety risks. And the level of categorization they go down to is quite detailed. Now, it may not be perfect data, but it's been out there a while. It's getting refined over time. And often what I find working with engineers is the quality of the data may be good enough for a decision, but the engineer really wants very definitive data. And so I've had many arguments with engineers in evaluating capital maintenance projects that reduce risk. The argument often is, well, one of the arguments is we're able to make this decision with less data than the engineer believes we need. We're able to make a decision with less information than we think we need, simply because often you only need to know the direction, and you've got enough information to know the direction, up or down. And particularly with safety, remember you're trying to avoid the intolerable risks. And where you've got those involved, the decision is easier. You do anything you need to mitigate that intolerable risk down to a tolerable level, or you exit. You have to do that. So that's one step. You've got a carrot of safety, right? At the very top, there's one zone with intolerable risks, where that's how you operate. If you can't mitigate it down into the next zone, you just have to exit. You're not going to risk somebody's life. If there's a meaning, if there's a high enough probability, which there's industry standards defined around that too, and between nations, there's a lot of thought, like I said, has gone into how to do these quantitative risk assessments. The next zone is where it gets much more difficult in that carrot. That's the ALARP zone, as low as reasonably practicable, and that's where all the problem lies. And that's where maybe a QRA can start to benefit from some of the practices used in the DA world. So I agreed on one thing. The industry is getting far better. In fact, I really strongly objected to how this panel was originally written. I said analysis is highly flawed, and it's because how the value metrics are used in the analysis. I very much disagree with that. I still would say implementation of decisions is maybe the organizational issues are far more important. It's that other link in the decision quality chain.
Right. Well, that's because Josh wrote up that first
Okay.
one. Max, we need one piece of critical data to continue the quality of this panel, and that would be the code to unlock the iPad.
And actually, I don't disagree with what you said.
All right, thank you so much. All right, let's turn this over to you now. Let's start filtering some of the questions that you might be most interested in. All right, here's one for you. Safety and compliance are seen as cost. How do you really quantify the benefit? Who wants to start with that one?
I'll start.
There we go.
I'll start.
All right.
So it's like any. I think it all starts with framing. I mean, and we heard that yesterday. I mean, and people who know me, this is my mantra, right? I really do think the single biggest benefit that introduction of DA to any organization can be to add clarity to frame, add clarity to purpose. That's 90% of the value. The analytics are great, don't get me wrong, and I've built complex models, but just getting the problem defined right, I think is where so much of the value add is. The same thing can be done for the safety side. If you're being forced to do something, understanding, well, first of all, is it something that really is against your values? And really, I would say in the oil and gas business, safety is not opposed to the values. I think gaming the system is a risk, and I've seen, again, this is where the framing comes in. I've seen an awful lot of projects that were justified as safety projects to get around some of the analysis required to justify. And then that goes and poisons the well, because then people go and say, okay, you're abusing the safety system. But to get back to what was really said, that how do you get the value metric out of it? It's first of all, understand, are you being asked to do something that actually is opposed to your values? And or is there something you can do in conjunction to it to increase the value function? If you're going to be forced to go and increase the inspection frequency of some pieces of equipment, can you actually learn something that'll help you run your business at the same time?
Okay. All right.
Yeah,
I'd
like to follow up on that a little bit. First of all, I want to agree with Jim that you don't need the exact data. I took Ron Howard's decision analysis course at Stanford years ago, and one of the things that just moved me the most was, just find out the probability at which you're indifferent to these two decisions, for God's sakes. And often you're far from that. Well, now decision made, And I think that's really important. We don't need perfect data. But back to safety, reliability. Well, wait a minute. There are trade-offs. And this is like rolling the die, but the safety guy is worried about the twos, and the reliability guy is worried about the fours. And unless you keep the dice alive, you'll never see the trade-off curve between those. You have to see the trade-off curve. And if you don't have a trade-off curve, then you can't be operating efficiently. So when it finally comes to deciding how to run your company, it's going to be an arm wrestle Right. Well, let's arm wrestle along some Pareto optimal frontier as opposed to arm wrestling way off in the mud somewhere where you're not close to any of the frontiers.
I'd say two things. First, about compliance. Compliance is often a higher driver than safety in how budgeting decisions are made. License to operate, we absolutely have to comply. And then when you talk about safety, it gets a little bit fuzzier. But what often happens too is because these companies are so focused on compliance, they may not do a risk analysis that they should do on safety. And the other thing I guess I'd say too, in the oil and gas industry and the companies I've worked in, I've seen a large opportunity space for changing things that both improve safety and improve economics. The opportunity space is pretty large often, and I think connecting that with my previous ideas, I think a lot of times it's because of the management system, and the management system has costs on the economic side as well as on the safety side, and you can often get benefits on both sides by focusing on those organizational issues, the safety management system, enterprise risk management as well. I guess one last point to make too on this, a big part of what should happen, I think, in the future is trying to prioritize risk mitigations in a sensible way, and it's really hard to do. We had a good presentation last year about how an electrical utility is able to prioritize asset maintenance. They're not dealing as much with the safety side of it, so there's another step to take with those kinds of systems that have been developed, but that's a big piece of what needs to get done in the future, and that's how enterprise risk management comes into it.
Excellent, thank you. A big hot question for a lot of people here is, how do we communicate risk with the public? Non-logical choices are being made because of public perception. Rail cars over pipelines, for instance. New nuclear power generation as a non-starter, etc. What are your thoughts on that? Who wants to go first? Jim, you're fired up, man. Hey, you can see it.
No, I was trying to recall the psychology side of this. People have a real hard time in thinking about risk. It's just very difficult for us. The way we have all these biases, for one thing. Availability bias maybe particularly affects risk perceptions, right? In terms of talking to the public about it, I don't have an easy answer there. It's probably another area where decision analysis can help, though.
Excellent. That's
yes.
what we wanted to hear.
I'd like to say something about that. So, number one, again, at my nonprofit, our lives are devoted to creating unambiguous communications of uncertainty. Now, I'm going to separate risk from uncertainty because I see risk as someone's utility function applied to an uncertainty. And I used to throw around the term unambiguous uncertainty because it had a good ring to it. But it turns out now there are published papers on this subject, and this is such fascinating stuff. And it's going to help us with this public perception. So I show you a deck of 10 cards. 5 of them are red, 5 of them are blue. It's shuffled. I say, you got to wager on whether the top card is red. You know, that's experiment 1. Experiment 2. I have a deck of 10 cards. They're blue and red only. All I tell you is there's at least one red card, at least one blue card. You have to wager that the top card is red. Well, hell, it's 50-50 in either case, right? So what's the difference between those two experiments that could be measured with a machine? The answer is, and what kind of machine would you measure it with? Turns out you'd measure it with a functional MRI machine, and with question 2, your amygdala lights up like a Christmas tree because of the ambiguity of the deck. How about that? So now unambiguous uncertainty means something, right? It means basically a database of die rolls, and you know what the database is, and we all agree on it. And Taleb would say, by the way, that doesn't really explain uncertainty, and I'd agree. He has something called the ludic fallacy, that you can explain uncertainty by rolling dice, right? I have something called the ludic fallacy, that you can understand uncertainty without rolling dice, right? So it's like, I think of unambiguous uncertainty as being uncertainty light or uncertainty with training wheels. And I think we're going to have to use something like that to get to the public.
Excellent. Now, Rob, would you like that question or would you like another one?
Well, I would like to
We've
respond
got-
to that question because I'm going to be
Excellent.
controversial here. I don't
Perfect.
think the energy industry has any chance by itself of reaching the public. I think we have a credibility problem. I think that all the rational discussion. Well, first of all, I think society is increasingly unrational, but that's another issue. So I think that all of our clear and logical reasoning arguments that work for us don't work for the public. I think that the best we can do as an industry from the public side of things is be invisible. I think the people we need to work with are the regulators. I think what you need to have is what the public perceive as an unbiased or somebody who's working for them to come out and say what the oil or what the energy industry doing makes sense. So I would take your approach, but I would say the people to deal with are the regulators. They're very intelligent people in the civil service. Get below the political level. Get to the people that are knowledgeable, and there are very, very knowledgeable people. They have different viewpoints that we talked about this morning. They might be frequentists versus Bayesians. There's all those kinds of issues, but they are intelligent and they are willing to listen. If you can convince them, you might have a chance of taking some of these arguments and getting the public to pay attention.
Hey, amen. Let's do it.
All right. Well, I think we've all had a little bit of fun here thanks to our funambulists. I want to thank today's panel. And in the event that you guys have got any further questions, please feel free to meet with them after this. Thanks very much.